First, we're going to turn to Dr. Robert McLachlan, who's going to walk us through some of the climate and ecological impacts of the aerospace industry. And I'd just like to introduce Robert. He's a mathematician at Massey University. He writes on climate change, sustainability, and environmental issues at planetaryecology.org. And recently, with Paul Callister, has been studying the prospects for the New Zealand aviation industry to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So I'd just like to turn over to Dr. McLachlan, who's going to share a PowerPoint with us as well. The chat is open, and we're happy for people to ask questions. We just ask people, if you're not muted, to go ahead and mute your microphone so that you don't interrupt the speakers. Thanks very much. And over to you, Dr. McLachlan.
Kia ora tātou, and thank you very much, Valerie, for this invitation. Can everyone hear me and see the slide there? Yep, very good. So my two little pictures on my slide here. This book, You Will Go to the Moon, that was one of my early readers, one of my earliest memories. I loved this book. I was born in 1964, so I was pretty much a child of the space age. And then on the right here, we have an artist's view of what hopefully will be New Zealand's first satellite. It's called MethaneSat. It's a joint enterprise between the New Zealand government and the Environmental Defence Society in the US, and it's had some delays. It's now expected to launch next January. And it will give very fast and high resolution views of methane, natural gas leaks, mostly from fossil fuel facilities and pipelines, and the idea that they can then be repaired very quickly. So that's an example of a positive use of space to drown out some of the gloom and doom, which is coming up on the following slides. So this is my view of where we are at the moment. There's two things going on and related to this, with the extreme global ecological crisis, primarily due to fossil fuels, but also other resources. And we stand on the verge of this new era. Lots of talk in the media about electric planes and so on, autonomous aircraft, more flights to space, and of course increased militarization and commercialization of space. People talking about going to get minerals from asteroids and all sorts of power from space. There was even a cover of The Listener talking about power from space, all kinds of new ideas, which in my view are ridiculous and dangerous, but they're certainly ideas that are out there and being discussed. Here's a I know more about the sustainability side than the peace side, but here's an article from I saw this morning, published yesterday, from The Conversation. There we go. Killer robots about to be launched on us, and there's an Australian connection. The Australian government called for local companies to suggest how they might build large numbers of drones, and one Australian company is already selling cheap cardboard drones to Ukraine. But the main link, as I see it, between the two things is that unless society can become sustainable, you'll have increased competition for resources. And that's been a dominant view for a very long time, that is a major source of conflict around the world, is access to resources. So here we see the annual number of objects launched into space. It was fairly steady through most of my life. And then just in the last 3 or 4 years, it's completely taken off, primarily due to SpaceX lowering the cost of space, getting into space, and a large number of satellites launched are due to things like Starlink, these large constellations. Now you notice this graph starts in 1957 with Sputnik, right? But actually, the first object in space was in fact a missile, the V2 rocket, 1942. So that was really the dawn of the space age. And even today, most rockets are actually weapons. ICBMs travel through space, they're guided from space. Every night same thing today, every night you can watch drone warfare in Ukraine. They're all guided from space by GPS. So again, going back to before the dawn of the space age, David Laster wrote in 31, whether the man of the future, looking back to 31, will wish that the rocket had never been invented, no one knows. The rocket is one of the creations of the human mind that serves as a test of our right to inherit the earth. Its powers of good and evil are so equal and opposite. So that situation is really unchanged today. If you're interested in looking into this more, I would recommend this book by Daniel Dewdney called Dark Skies. Very preaching a cautionary tale about this new era of expansionists in space, particularly anti-humans in space and space colonization and so on, but also mining in space. But the key thing he's making here is that if it gets easier and cheaper to get to orbit, then all space activities become cheaper and easier, whether or not their effects are desirable. And our track record for successfully governing new technologies that allow us to exploit new regions, it's really just terrible. Right? So, and even in space, like there's already a problem with the space junk causing problems because it wasn't dealt with early enough. And I find this final paragraph very striking too. Space expansionism rests on dubious assumptions about human control of nature and technology and governance of new technologies. That to me is the key point. So what I'm going to do is I looked at the list of speakers at the Aerospace conference that's coming up, and I've just taken it. It looks very interesting, all sorts of interesting things happening there. But I've just chosen 4 of the speakers to do little snapshots of how they're generally seen in the public and how I view them somewhat differently. So this one is Heart Aerospace, a Swedish startup company who's trying to build an electric plane. And they had this 19-seater plane, and Sounds Air ordered it, and there was a lot of positive media coverage in New Zealand. Everyone thought we'd all be flying around in electric planes in no time at all. But I wrote a study of this with the information I could get publicly, and there was just no way that this could possibly work from an engineering point of view. It's very, very far-fetched. And indeed, it was cancelled. It was cancelled last year. But it wasn't pitched as a cancellation. It was pitched as, we're doing this new improved one, this much bigger one. It's not electric anymore, it's a hybrid. But my bigger point is all of this media coverage and everything they're trying to do, which may or may not work, is basically irrelevant to the question of sustainability of aerospace. What is needed in aviation industry is regulation to stop the industry increasing emissions, and they will not do it voluntarily. They're basically getting off scot-free at the moment, and that's the core problem. And if you were a cynic, you could say that all of this discussion of this kind of thing is really a distraction, an attempt at a distraction from the real issue. The next one is Whisk Aero. So this is the Jetsons flying car industry. There must be like 500 of these startups around the world, but this is the one that's been in New Zealand. They're undergoing trials. Supported by the New Zealand government, although it's an American company. The special thing about this one is it doesn't have a pilot, so it's part of the drone segment. Now, again, the media coverage is just so distorted and breathless and not passing even a basic test of credibility that it's a bit of a joke. So you read in the paper that you'll be able to do a city hop, from Auckland to Waiheke or something for $3 a kilometre. Now, that's the cost of renting an e-scooter. But this aircraft is going to cost $8 million, whereas an e-scooter costs about 800. If the vehicle costs 10,000 times as much, it's not going to cost the same amount to rent. How many people do you know who can afford to rent $8 million vehicles for short trips? It's just, the whole thing is basically ludicrous. And again, it's a distraction, but it's sort of worse because large amounts of money flood into this area. Engineers work on it, even on things that can never possibly work, and most of which will fail, and the media talk it up to a ridiculous degree. Again, I don't know whether this will ever work. It may work, it may not work, but it's basically irrelevant to the questions of sustainability. The third one, now this Tāwhaki initiative, I only know about it from the information that's provided on their website. So I don't have any inside knowledge, I'm afraid. But it's based at Tāwhaki, which at Kaiteriti Spit. And their twin kaupapa is to heal and rejuvenate the unique whenua at Kaiteriti and advance Aotearoa's aerospace industry. It's a joint initiative between Tū Runanga and the Crown. And they've got this land here, 1,000 hectares of land. This is a quote from the website. Kaiteriti is a key part of the largest and most ecologically outstanding area remaining in Lower Canterbury. Tautaki is already receiving widespread inquiries from parties interested in supporting the dual kaupapa of rejuvenation and aerospace development. Now, this is right next to Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere, which is one of the most polluted lakes in the country, all due to the massive expansion, unregulated expansion of the dairy industry. It's dead. 20 years of attempting to rectify it have not yielded any improvement. It's really just a classic study of failure to regulate a polluting industry. So how, I can't get my head around it, how building a spaceport right next to it and planting some native shrubs, which is the proposal, 5,000 native shrubs will be planted, how that can rejuvenate this ecologically outstanding area is just completely beyond my understanding. Rocket Labs had previously applied for consent to launch into space every 3 days from this site, although they later moved to Mahia. And the final one, who are also speaking at the conference, New Zealand airports. I'm involved with an effort to try to stop the construction of a new international airport at Terrace in central Otago, because the whole airport industry is even more pro-growth, essentially actively planning to increase emissions than the airlines themselves, because you can't have more flights without more airports. And in this case, it's a particularly extreme one. So here they are saying New Zealand airports, they want a greater public understanding and a positive narrative to counterbalance the perception that aerospace and aviation have generally poor outcomes for the environment. Yeah, well, they do have poor outcomes for the environment. There's no denying that. And trying to spin it some other way, well, maybe it can work for a while, but not indefinitely. And this particularly annoys me. This is a straw man argument. Nobody that I'm aware of is proposing to stop all flying immediately. But what the industry wants to do is grow it indefinitely. So it's the difference between keeping it steady or slowly declining versus unlimited growth. The growth in the past was only possible because the industry was unregulated. So, attempting to wrap up, this is what I wrote in my submission to the aerospace policy. There are some parts of it that are good and can be good. The Earth observation satellites, for example, that is in fact needed. But the whole industry needs to be just kept a much closer eye on and regulated, for example, with the even the direct environmental act of a space launch, for example, is not really monitored at the moment. And there are some things that we should not be doing. As we will hear later, we should be extremely wary of the ties between New Zealand companies and either any military work they're doing or any ties they have to overseas companies that are doing military work. I would like to shine a light on that. And as I showed in the earlier slide, the killer robots thing is a bit alarming. And this is not the Zero Ballistic Missile Treaty. That's not just some fringe idea from some peace activists. That's a major international effort that people have been working on for a long time. And it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that the government might one day support that. The only reason the war in Ukraine is not even worse than it is at the moment is that the medium-range missiles that Russia previously had and could have launched from Russia to Ukraine, they were banned by a treaty between the US and Russia. All missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,000 kilometers were banned and no longer exist. So sometimes progress can be made. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. McLachlan. Really appreciate that.